Philip, thank you very much for joining us at this At Home Around the World series of discussions. And my understanding is that you are in a different part of the world to me because you're over the border in Scotland. Is that right? Is that where you are at the moment?
Yes, I'm in Glasgow just now, happily still part of the UK, but who knows what might happen in the future.
Yeah, now you have certain devolved rights in Scotland, and one of them, certainly listening to your First Minister on the TV and on the radio, seems to be that she's a little ahead of the game compared to the rest of the UK. Is that your view? And do you see any benefits of being locked down in Scotland as opposed to the rest of the UK?
Putting aside the politics of it, I think Nicola Sturgeon, is actually doing, is behaving in a very statesperson-like manner. And I think that she is being a bit more conservative, appropriately more conservative in terms of, keeping to the lockdown and not wanting to take any risks by releasing it too early.
Okay, yeah. And from a personal point of view, how are you finding working under lockdown? What have you had to change?
And it's had less of an impact on me because a couple of years ago when I was still a lawyer, I used to work with 500 people. Now I predominantly work on my own. So a lot of my meetings, or all of my meetings, are taking place by Zoom rather than in person. But I work on my own to a great extent, so it's probably had less of an impact on me than on others. I think Zoom has got its limitations, and maybe we'll discuss that later. But by and large, as I say, it's had less of an impact on me.
Okay. Were you, obviously being in Glasgow, there are people you need to meet in other parts of the world. Were you using some form of video conferencing anyway before COVID, or is this completely new to you?
Yes, I was using video conferencing, but it would be a mixture. It'd be some video conferencing and there'd be some meeting in person. And it's amazing how quickly you adapt just to doing, everything by video conferencing, or just by phone call. Sometimes actually I think phone is actually better than video conferencing. But by and large, business continues. I sit on a number of boards, and all of our meetings, are being, conducted by video conferencing. And I think there's a lot to be learned in terms of how you do that. And I think we're in the infancy when it comes to that. But as a medium, I think it can be made to work.
Interesting comment you made about sometimes you think telephone rather is better than video conferencing. What do you see as the pros and cons?
There's an interesting article that was published last week in National Geographic, and it was talking about how exhausting, video conferencing is. And that's correct, because I think you try and pick up visual cues, which you can't in a two-dimensional screen, and which you can in a real meeting. And I think that brings about stress. I think it, creates tiredness, fatigue. Whereas I think a phone call, you know that you're just listening, and that's something that we're more used to doing. I think sometimes that's better. There's an adage that if something is a video conference, ask whether you can do it as a telephone call. If something's an email, ask whether you can do it as a text. I think sometimes we over communicate.
Yeah, interesting. I remember years ago, you're probably old enough to remember this as well, in Tomorrow's World, which used to predict the future for science. And I remember certainly in a program in the late 60s or early 70s, they showed the first video phone and made the very clear and certain prediction that this was how telephone communication would be going forwards. And it just never happened. I remember being horrified at the thought, frankly, because the ability to answer your phone in a state of undress or whilst doing something else is still a valuable thing. But do you think that after this video conferencing boom, we're going to go back simply to audio communication, or do you think there'll be a vestige of it still around?
No, I think video conferencing is here to stay, but I think we have to get better at it. And I think that we should treat video conferencing, as a production, with think about how it's moderated, think about how you make it, more impactful, rather than just converting what you did, in a regular meeting to the screen. It's the same as, I love listening to radio plays. And of course there, you don't have the benefit of the visual, but the director, has to, make alterations to ensure that you enjoy it, and can keep up with what's going on just the same. And I think we should be doing, taking a similar approach when it comes to video conferencing, actually treating it as a production.
So in terms of treating it as a production, and if you were either the producer or the director, depending on which role you want to fill, how would you go about setting it up? What would you change?
I think the first thing is that think about how much time you actually need for it. By default, video conferences seem to last 40 minutes or an hour. How much time do you need? Work out, what everybody's role is in it, work out the protocols, think about, whether it would be useful to have a presentation, at the outset, rather than just have everybody jumping in and out all the time.
Yeah, I can see the benefit. I mean, in some respects, it's like managing a good meeting, have an agenda, have a timetable, and make sure people stick to it. But perhaps we're not treating video conferencing quite so formally at this stage.
Yeah, I think that's right. And as I say, you just have to be aware that, people who are participating, are not going to pick up some of the social clues that they would in a meeting, and, compensate for that.
Okay. Now, you're obviously doing a lot of writing at the moment, or it seems that you're doing a lot of writing. Almost every edition of the Times seems to carry a Philip Rodney column. And you've written on a number of issues since the COVID-19 restrictions came into place. And one of the things I thought was fascinating was reading your article on effectively don't waste a good crisis, and how restrictions that we're under might stimulate creativity. And I just wondered if you could to develop that a little bit, because I thought it was an interesting proposition.
Well, it's nice of you. It's nice to know that I've got one reader beyond my mum. Yes, no, I do a weekly column for the Times, and they give me pretty free rein. So, yeah, yes, just getting back to the issue of restrictions. I think in that article I was referring to a concert which Keith Jarrett, the pianist, gave in Cologne. And for those who don't know, Keith Jarrett is a real perfectionist. In fact, I understand that when he gives a concert, he gets people to go round and give the audience sucking candy just in case they feel the need to cough during one of his performances. So what happened was in October 1975, this 17-year-old promoter, it was the first concert she'd promoted, and she'd arranged for Keith Jarrett to perform at the Opera House. And he had all sorts of riders in his contract, one of which was that he had to have a Bösendorfer 290 Imperial grand piano. And when he turned up, that piano wasn't there. In fact, it was just a small rehearsal piano. And, understandably, he went ballistic. And he said he wasn't prepared to perform. And the young promoter pleaded with him, and eventually he relented and he agreed that he would perform. And he gave, what is regarded by many as the performance of his life. And in fact, it was recorded as the Köln concert, and is the best-selling album of piano music of all time. And musicologists have, analysed the paradox, over the years as to why, given that he was given such a poor instrument, he gave such a mesmerising performance. And the conclusion that's been reached is that it wasn't despite the restrictions, it was because of the restrictions that he performed so well. And I think that that's true, that sometimes, when we are restricted, when there are limitations in what we're able to do, we're able to delve into, our creativity, into our imagination, and come up with, additional ideas and, access a strength which perhaps we don't have in day-to-day life. And likewise, I do think that, as a result of, this awful pandemic and the restrictions that have been put on us, people will come up with, new ideas, with things. They'll experiment, they'll try things that they haven't done before. And I think that there will be enormous benefits that will come from it. None of us wanted this to happen, but sometimes, when there are limitations, there is a certain creativity that's released.
I think it's an excellent point. I mean, we're all aware of the necessity is the mother of invention proverb. Lawyers are not necessarily renowned for their creativity. Do you have some hope for the legal profession that these restrictions might drive us to be more inventive?
Yes, I do. And I think we shouldn't think of the legal profession in isolation. I think the legal profession there is, to serve society. So we follow society. It's not the other way round. And I think we're going to have to make some adaptations. I mean, there are a whole range of issues. I think that, after this, I think all that's happening just now has to be paid for. I think there's going to be less money floating around, and I think that's going to have an impact on, the way we sell our services. I think that the legal profession has been highly respected and valued, but maybe to the expense of the medical profession, and maybe in terms of the pecking order, we're going to be less highly regarded over the next few years than we have perhaps in the past. I think that will have an impact. I think that we're going to have to think about, how we create efficiencies in our businesses. I think there is a lot of waste. One of the boards I sit on is the housing trust. I chair the development company there, and in the building industry, 50% of materials are wasted. Now, I'm not pretending for 1 minute that there's waste of that magnitude in the legal profession, but I think there'll be room for efficiencies there. I think that there's an opportunity for us to be a lot more collaborative. I saw, for instance, that, Volkswagen and Ford have entered into an arrangement where they'll share chassis and engines and brakes and transmissions for trucks going forward. There's no, merger or sharing of or transfer of shareholdings. It's just collaboration. And I think there are things that lawyers do behind the scenes where we could actually collaborate with each other. Things like training, things like, I suppose, anti-money laundering, things like that. So I think there's room for more collaboration. And I think there's room for more collaboration with our clients. When you look at the advertising agency, you'll see that advertising agencies put whole teams into businesses. They sit there as virtual departments. And whilst secondment is second nature to law firms, maybe, we have to think, about, teams getting more involved in with our clients. So I think there are a lot of areas where we will need to change. As I say, there'll be less money floating around. We'll have to create efficiencies. So yeah, that's just some thought, and I think where it will go. I think there'll also be a call for different types of services. Clearly insolvency and restructuring is going to be an area where there'll be a lot more activity, as will, general litigation. And, lawyers are very good at sort of nipping and tucking and, ensuring that they, provide a service that's, relevant to the requirements of their clients.
An interesting comment you made right at the beginning there about the reevaluation of the value of doctors and nurses and health professionals, and I guess as well I think certainly for all those involved in homeschooling, there'll be a reevaluation of the value of teachers as well. And between the wars, if you went into a profession, you were either a solicitor, a teacher, or a doctor. And the remuneration was not very far apart. Now, lawyers have expanded massively their remuneration, certainly since the mid-60s. If there's going to be a rebalancing, do you think that the days of the continuous growth of law firms, both in terms of size and profitability, is going to be impacted by the after effects of COVID-19 because there's not as much money flushing around?
I do think they will. I mean, I think that, you know, lawyers have gone through a golden period, and that may have been due to, you know, the requirements of, you know, society at that time. You know, as we move to a digital age, as there are different issues that came across that required the engagement of lawyers, it may be, you know, that after this, society will recognize that the impact that, you know, other professionals make is just as important, maybe more so. So I think, yes, that will, you know, have an impact on the context in which lawyers operate, the amounts that they earn. Yes, I do think it will have that impact. I also think that, you know, maybe we have to, you know, rethink, you know, this idea of constant growth. You know, I recently wrote about Kate Rayworth, who is an economist at Oxford, previously worked both for Oxfam and I think the UN. And it's fascinating if you actually go into TED Talks and put in her name, Raworth. She does this excellent talk about what she calls donut economics, and she's written a book about it. And basically her premise is that, you know, in the past, you know, we've measured success only in terms of GDP. You know, we constantly grow to try and actually deal with the problems that we create in the process. So if you generate pollution, then the way through that is to make more money so you can actually deal with the pollution. And the concept of donut economics is that there's a hole in the middle, and of course no one should fall into that. The inner circle, you know, represents the minimum that people need in terms of, you know, health, law and order and things like that to survive. And the outer circle, you know, represents as far as you need go, or as far as you can go, without damaging the environment and without starting, you know, to create problems elsewhere. And I think that's quite an attractive proposition. You know, it's one which Amsterdam, you know, has adopted as the means out of the impact of COVID. And maybe we have to start thinking not in terms of, you know, growth being a goal of its own, but rather looking at a, you know, more holistic approach to, you know, growing our law firms and growing our businesses generally.
Yes, I thought that was an interesting article. Your mother sent it to me, I should say. But I think that the interesting bit was, as you've identified, less a focus on growth and simply doing what you need to do to thrive.
Yeah,
I thought was a great way of looking at how to progress out of this thing, and I wonder to what extent law firms will view that as the limit of their ambition, or whether they are still going to want to grow at the sort of rates that they have been growing.
I think it may move in that direction, because I think both you and I are old enough to remember, and I'm much older than you, whenever anyone joined a law firm, they wanted to be a partner, and they'd work all the crazy hours that required. I think there's a generation, you know, of lawyers now who looked at the grey hairs, or in my case, no hairs, and thought, you know, do I really want to do this? You know, I want a balance in my life. And I would never criticize that. I can see exactly why people might do that. So I think, you know, there does come a time when, you know, people say enough is enough. And as I think I mentioned in that article, Homer Simpson said, you can't buy happiness, but you can buy a donut. And perhaps that's the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps all lawyers need donuts more than happiness at the moment, if you can find somewhere to buy them. Well, that's great, Philip. Thank you very much indeed. It's been fascinating talking to you, as always. And good luck with the rest of the restrictions, however long they last in Scotland and in the UK. And I look forward to reading your article next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I really enjoyed it. And I'll look forward to accessing this online and sharing it with my mum.
Great. Thank you.